Good morning. Thanks for joining in with us here this morning. What we'd first like to do is just again talk about cold weather crane maintenance and things that you can look for, even now that we're getting into the spring season where it's warming up, that can prevent you from having breakdowns out in the field and having a very cost crane recovery and repair out in the field. Things that we see, hose inspection and areas where hoses wear is probably one of the most common items that you'll see on a crane. So any place where hoses are bending at the top of the column to the boom, we've got areas highlighted where you want to look. So where those hoses are flexing at the top of the column and the boom meet, in the middle area of the crane where the knuckle is, you'll have extension hoses that are in the trays that are constantly going back and forth and moving. Those are areas that you want to inspect for weather checking, possible leaks, broken wires in the hoses, where once the wires start breaking you're going to see some rusty wires. So just a quick visual inspection of those areas on the hoses, and we've got several models in our slides here that will show those hoses, looking for defects in those. We've actually pointed out where there are some cranes and equipment now for the outriggers where the hoses are internal. Those are going to be a little harder to inspect, but what you're going to be looking for is possible weeping and oil being present inside. If you're seeing oil dripping those extensions, you'll want to at least get it to a shop where they can actually see, do we have a problem with those hoses in there. So looking where the outriggers extend out is another area to inspect. The next slide here is showing a hydraulic swivel. So when the hoses are coming from the valves, and they go up into the top of the crane, those swivels are there to make sure that the hose doesn't twist. But you see any leaking in those areas there, you want to get those swivels actually replaced and taken care of before it becomes a major leak. Let's talk about hydraulic oil condition. And there's many things that can happen. We're going to talk about how to check your hydraulic oil. You can visually see some contamination if you've got water in the system. Talk about oil filters and oil sampling. So the next slide here just shows this is one type of a sight gauge in the hydraulic tank where you should definitely see oil in the sight glass. When you have your crane stowed, that's where your oil level should be. Now it doesn't need to be full to the top, but you do want to definitely see oil in that sight gauge when the machine is in its stowed position. You want to check for oil clarity. It should have a clear color. There's different types of hydraulic oils out there, but if you see a white milky substance in it, you know that you're having some water contamination. The picture shown here is a typical sight glass that we would see in an IMT 4-story wallboard crane. The next slide is going to show the Fosse hydraulic oil tank. This is the steel tank. The newer tanks will be a plastic tank, which we'll show in the next slide. But again, looking at the sight glasses, sometimes the sight glass will fade from the UV rays of the sun, so it's really difficult to even see the sight glass. You may want to try to clean that or replace those sight glasses. But this type of hydraulic tank will show those levels of the hydraulic oil. The next slide here does show the plastic hydraulic tank. Very similar to the IMT, where it has a sight glass will show you the level itself. This slide here again is very similar, but that's on a Paul finger crane. A sight glass which again will show the level and the clarity. The IMT one, which is the 6-story crane, which is a little harder to see, is a plastic sight tube. Again, you want to be pretty much to the top with that sight gauge, and you want again to have a clear one where you can visibly see it. It again can deteriorate over time. Want to give a little recommendation. We get calls once in a while about what type of hydraulic fluid we should be using in our crane. It does depend on region. We recommend in the northern regions part of the country to use an ISO 32. If you're in the southern region, if you're getting down to Florida, Georgia, Alabama, California, an ISO 46 would be recommended. But again, if you've got questions, you can call our tech support department. We can give you more technical information on what you need to look for. This is just another sample of hydraulic specs of what is recommended for your cranes. This slide is going to show that there are some cranes, the IMT 24562 and 28562, actually has oil in the crane base, and it's kind of a forgotten thing because you really can't see it. There is a small sight glass that can tell you the level. I can tell you that it is recommended to change that oil in the base, I would say at least every 3 years, and that is lubricating your bushings for where the crane rotates. The reason it's important to change that hydraulic oil is water can get into that crane base from the column. It's not a sealed component, and once water gets into the base, it will contaminate it, and you lose your lubrication benefit to the bushings, which will create a premature wear of the bushings themselves. So it's a good practice to at least get that replaced every 3 years. The next slide is going to show planetary rotation gearboxes. So there are some models that are using an actual planetary. The IMT Series 3, the Paulfinger cranes will have planetaries. So they are filled with gear lube. You actually have to have a shop remove the fill plug just to check level. The main thing I would recommend is if you're seeing some visible leakage from that planetary, you need to get it to a shop to have that checked out. If you're not seeing leakage, there's a good chance that there's no issues and your level's good and oil is good on there. But again, visible leakages are going to be. One thing that we recommend on hydraulic oil is you can do an oil sampling kit. They're relatively cheap, about $18. There are some manufacturers that require that annually to have your hydraulic oil sampled. But again, you will get a condition report. It's just a good way to check, especially if you have questions about, hey, I haven't changed my oil in the last 2 years. Maybe I can check the condition of it. And doing an oil sample is another way. We have those sample kits available. If you don't have access to them, we can get them through our parts department. Filters. Filters on a hydraulic system should be changed minimally once a year, and there are many different styles of filters. Types of filters: there's suction filters, return filters, and pressure filters. The newer crane models are running higher pressures, which are leading towards a requirement to have. But it's good practice at least once a year to have those filters changed out. On continuous rotation cranes, we are going to have an electrical swivel. Maintenance-wise, the best thing you can do is if you're having some electrical issues with your crane, it's typically located in the center of the crane, but if you're having issues, get it to a shop. Some condensation can get in there, and that's what's going to start creating some electrical issues. We're mentioning that just so you're aware that on a continuous rotation crane, meaning you can rotate around and around, you're not limited to, let's say, a 420 degree rotation. Oil coolers. Every material handling crane does have an oil cooler. In the wintertime, that's not something that may come on or not come on, but we are coming into the springtime. Typically in the summer, that cooler should be running. They're going to turn on at about 100 degrees Fahrenheit for hydraulic for the hydraulic temperature. Just a good practice to make sure that your operator when running knows that that crane is running. Again, because of higher pressure running cranes creates more heat. We are getting some cranes that are getting up into 5,000 psi, so it's very important to make sure that that is running. This is a picture slide showing the ball valve, which is the red handle in the picture. We typically will tie them off, but a good check is just to make sure that that ball valve is completely open. The plastic tie may be broken at some time. The close often doesn't get tied back where it's going to be open. It should be straight in line with your suction hose. So just check that and make sure that that is good. It can be hydraulic hose inspection. You want to check high flex areas, and we will show some of those inspections here of what we're looking for. Where it knuckles up the stabilizer, the rotator, and a recommendation. So we're going to show some slides of what some bad hoses look like. You can see this one slide up in the upper left corner. You can see that there is actually some breaking of the braiding at the crimp. The top right one, we've got the rubber protection that has been worn off, and now we've got the wires in that hose are starting to rust. The lower left one, you can see again we've got some wear, and the one to the right, that is actually a hose that has failed. It blew out and it started to leak. There's things that you can do to protect the hoses if it's in a flex area where you're having problems rubbing. We've got some cloth sock that can be slid on. The yellow or black in the middle upper shows the protection that can be put on, and those are items that we recommend that you do when you see those areas where it's rubbing. It just helps continue the life of that hose a little longer. We'll talk about cold weather startup. I know we're getting towards the end of that, but engaging the PTO and letting your hydraulic fluid warm up a little bit before you start to run the crane with engine RPMs revved up. You can actually deadhead your outrigger controls, and that will help speed up warming up of the crane. And you just want to run the control several times before operation. Typically the engine RPMs are going to rev up. If you do it with the cruise control of the engine, it'll rev up about 950 RPMs. With the crane engine RPMs, you can actually do it by running about 1250 to 1300 engine RPMs is going to be max RPM. That again is something that you can do in the cold weather. Hydraulic tank heaters are an option that we do typically if you're looking at a new crane and you've had some cold weather issues. We can install them, or they can be done aftermarket. So these are just showing different types of hydraulic tank heaters that can be installed. So if you've got a crane, you've had some cold weather issues where the crane's running slow, they can be added. We can work with repair shops in your area in doing that. Greasing cranes in cold weather. We are seeing a lot more of auto greasers. And I'll just mention on auto greasers, they are very strict on what type of grease you use, either a 0 level or a number 1 grease. My recommendation on auto greasers, and I don't have any slides showing that, but we have seen a big uptick on auto greasers for the cranes and for on the trucks. Very important that your maintenance company is using the correct grease in those greasers. If you do not use the correct grease, the grease lines are going to clog up, and then it's not going to be greasing when you think it is, and you will have some major issues with it. Just this slide here on the left side shows a bad grease line that is actually breaking, ready to blow out. Worn grease lines will blow out. They're under pressure. If somebody doesn't inspect it, it's going to just keep on pumping on the ground rather than getting to the grease area, the greasing component. This slide is just showing crossover rods are something you want to watch over in the weather. They will start to stick, and you want to make sure that you grease those crossover rods. Crossover rods are your manual controls going to the opposite side of the crane. But again, if you do grease those, that will, and you want to have a lighter grease on those components. You don't want it to be a stiffer grease. What can happen in the cold weather is the crane will not return to center, so you're running by remote control, and then the valve does not go back to center and your crane keeps on running. So a lot of people think that I've got a problem with my remote. It's not the remote, it's just that the lever, because it's sticking in the cold weather, does not go back to neutral and just keeps on running. And we've had people where the crane will run into the building or actually hit something. This is just an example of grease areas, if you do not have an auto greaser, all the crane manufacturers offer them in their manuals. They're online, but it will show you where the grease points are. That's an IMT. Just some slides of areas that you want to grease. There are some areas on the outriggers and on the extensions that you can apply a Teflon grease, which is a little lighter grease and doesn't stick as much. We offer that grease here at V&H. It's a spray-on grease. It's roughly about $20 a can. Simple application. That'll be for outrigger extensions, for boom extensions. This is just another example of the IMT 24562, 28562 grease points. This is going to be on the Fosse. All Fosse cranes for the last 12 years have had auto greasers on them. But again, application areas of where those grease lines are going to. This is a pretty good example on a non-continuous wallboard crane. It happens to be a Fosse. They will typically, if you look at the upper bushing, that is where the grease is going, to the top and the bottom. And those are very critical grease components, and if they aren't getting greased properly or getting grease to them, it can be a major expense for replacement. If you can repair them, you might be talking $15,000. If you have to replace the column and base, you're in the neighborhood of possibly up to $40,000 to replace. But that is an example of just critical areas. This happens to be just a greasing chart for the Paul Finger wallboard. Again, that'll be in your manual for it. And the Teflon grease is mentioned on here. Auto greasers are not standard, but we are doing a lot of upfits on new cranes for auto greasers on the Paul Finger wallboard product. This will be some grease points. The Paul Finger is a rotation bearing, but it is not continuous rotation, but it's going to have the bearing. Rotation bearings are a little more forgiving than a base bushing type of one that we looked at on the Fosse or on the IMT crane. So making sure that you get grease at those points, again, are going to help on the crane. A few more rotation points on the Paul Finger wallboard crane that you need to make sure that you hit those areas. The grease certs are noted there. On the knuckle boom area, on the left slide shows you where there's some grease certs in there, and on the extension booms where you would apply the spray grease, and that is again a Teflon. Remote controls, maintenance wise, it's surprising that we see a number of transmitters where there's rubber boots that are torn. That's going to allow moisture inside, so if you see torn rubber boots on your controls, on the joystick ones, actuators issues which they can freeze in the wintertime. So these are just some things that we want to talk about in the slide. Rubber boots are shown on the left for the controls where water will get in there and they will freeze in the wintertime, but it just makes it stick. You want to look at your valves for any rubber boots where moisture can get in there, water can get in there and take the grease out. Those items again are just more maintenance. Check the condition of those levers. They'll wear out. There's really no greasing you can do there, but just check condition. I want to talk about safety a little bit. 3-point contact when you're climbing on ladders. We are seeing a lot less top seat controls, a lot more of ground control, so the ladders aren't as much as a safety concern, but we can take a look at some of those items. Climbing ladders, making sure we have the correct apparel during the wintertime and gloves so you have a good grip on the ladder. Just ensuring that you've got a good clean area where there isn't snow buildup on those items.
3-point contact means 3-limb contact at all times. When entering the cab, both feet must be firmly planted before a hand can exchange grip, and both hands must maintain contact for a foot to move. When exiting the cab, get out facing the equipment. Maintain hand grip until the feet are firmly planted. Only one hand at a time can move. Do not move a hand and foot at the same time. This is only 2-point contact. The same rules apply for going up the ladder. The feet must be firmly planted for a hand to exchange grip, and then the other hand. Note: your hands should not break contact while going up or down the ladder, and never carry anything in your hands while performing three-point contact. Also remember to use proper footwear, and if gloves are worn, they must provide necessary grip. This concludes three-point contact training.